Bernie Madoff was a Wall Street investor, part of an exclusive firm. In fact, he would even turn clients away, and he didn't want his customers talking about it. He said because it was kind of an exclusive club, and he only wanted to work with certain people, but really he just didn't want a lot of eyes on what was going on because he was running a Ponzi scheme. He was taking the money from investors, and whenever he got new investors, he would give that money to the other investors and say, oh, look, see, there's interest. But he would just take all that money and use it for himself. He had a $7 million apartment in New York City. He had a $1 million house in France. He had an $11 million, I think, 8,700 square foot house in Florida. He had a $7 million yacht in France. And he had just a lot. He had $2.6 million in jewelry and really lived a pretty opulent lifestyle. Well, when all that came crashing down, Bernie Madoff found himself in an 8x8 cell, making 24 cents an hour in prison. His son, Mark, committed suicide. His other son, Mark, from all the stress of what was happening, got cancer. All his friends were gone. He was the most vilified man in the United States because he lost people, not millions, but billions of dollars. We see these stories, these people who fell from great heights. In the news right now is Sean Combs. In the news a little while ago, Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby and Kevin Spacey, all these people that were at the top of their game, the top of their industry, and fell, facing prison and people that other people want nothing to do with. And we feel in some way that they deserve it, right? Because they really did these wrong things. And this is not true for Job, except for the contrast of where he was to where he is now. And that's really the focus of Job 29 and 30, is the way things were and the way things are. So you can imagine Bernie Madoff in prison, again, living this opulent lifestyle. Which house do I want to go to this summer? The one in France or the one in Florida? Or do I want to go to the one, somewhere else? And what do I want to stay on my yacht for a while? And now when he was in prison, he had no choice. He didn't get to pick who he was going to live with. He maybe got to pick what job he was doing, but he's making, again, 24 cents an hour. All that opulence was gone. And that's the contrast we see that Job is really lamenting in chapters 29 and 30. We're looking through the book of Job, not just as a man who lost everything, but as an example of what happens or why is it that some righteous people lose everything. And God said from the very beginning, one of the first verses was that Job was a righteous man, one that feared God and eschewed evil, right? So all of his friends coming and saying, oh, you're wicked, you're wicked, you're wicked. The Bible says that wasn't true. And Job is going to talk about that in our passage. And so it really was a righteous man. When we talk about why do bad things happen to good people, you're pretty hard-pressed to find a better man than Job. And really horrible things happened to him. And one day he lost everything and all 10 of his kids. Horrible, horrible tragedy all at once. And Job gets a little reflective. He's comparing his time now to what it was before. Look at Job 29, verses 1 and 2. Moreover, Job continued his parable and said, oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me. He's thinking about those times, and he's going to talk about that. And then he says in chapter 30, verse 1, but now, right? So there's the contrast, but now this is what's going on. Look at verse 16 of chapter 30. And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. So in chapter 29, he says, man, life was great. Everything was going really, really wonderfully. Chapter 30 is kind of a description of how things are going now. And it's that thought on how much things have changed that really is hard. One of the hardest things about loss, if you've experienced any loss in your life, one of the hardest things about that, especially significant, serious loss, is it isn't so much the loss of that thing or that person, but everything else that kind of goes around it, right? When you lose someone important, it's the loss of the future things that you were hoping to do. All the dreams and all the plans and all the hopes that you had, all of that gone with the person, with the thing. It's a loss of an environment, of just having them around, what they brought to your life, just having that continual presence. And it's a little easier if you don't know the person for very long, but it's not easy. It's the loss of the health. For many people, when they go through grief, there's a physical toll that's taken on them from all the stress of losing someone important to you. So there's a lot that goes along with, it's not just, if you've never been through this where you've lost someone important to you, you don't just you just get over it. It's just not the way that it goes. You can't expect people to just get over it because it's not just one person. It's not just like you're watching a play and someone comes in from stage left and eventually they go out stage right. That's not the way to think about people because there's so much more involved with it. And as Job is thinking about all that he's lost, there are three major areas where he focuses on in these two chapters. And so I want to talk about those things and how they affect us. First of all is the perceived loss of God's blessing. Now, he didn't necessarily lose God's blessing because in the end of the book, we find out that not only is God caring about Job and loving Job this whole time, but he also restores everything. But it's the perceived loss of God's blessing. So we pick it up in chapter 29, verses 1 through 6. And he says, I remember what it was like to walk with God and to have his blessing on me. Moreover, Job continued his parable and said, Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness. As I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, when I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured me out rivers of oil. I'll stop there. He says, I felt like God was preserving me. That word preserving, in verse number 2, preserved, is the word hedge. Now, it's translated save back in chapter 2:7, where God says to Satan, you can take his health, but his life needs to be saved. That's the same word here. So Job doesn't understand that God has saved him, and that has continued, but he feels like it was in the past. That was when God was saving me and hedging me about, and not anymore. He says that God showed him the way like a lamp in verse number 3. He says in verse 4 that he communed with God. He says, as I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle. The word secret means like a secret counsel. Like it was somebody that you were intimate with, somebody that you knew well. That's the idea of secret there. He says, I remember when it was just God and me. And maybe you've had those times where it's just you go on long prayer walks and you feel like he's walking with you. You feel like he's right there with you. And Job says, man, I remember those days. He's going to say in chapter 30, that's not the way it is anymore. But he's remembering those days. That's very special. He remembers when he had his children. And I think the idea isn't just having his children, but the idea that I just knew that God was blessing them and God was blessing me and God was with me. Remember we said in chapter 1 that Job would pray for his children on a pretty regular basis. God, if there's anything they've done to offend you, then Lord, look over that. So he was always thinking about God in connection with his children, and now his children are gone. He says he had more than heart could wish. He had enough where he said, I could wash my steps with butter. The rocks, even the rocks, it seems like, are just pouring oil out. That's just a picture of abundance. I had so much. It's easy to feel close to God when things are going well. Those physical blessings that we have are the most tangible things we have. That for some reason, the things that we can touch and see and interact with every day, those things seem more real to us than God. Not that God's not real to us, but it's hard when you think about all the things you have. You can think about them, you can list those out. But when you think about what does God mean to me, it's like, well, it's a little bit ethereal. It's a little bit like, well, God's invisible. So my relationship with God is not as tangible, And when we can see blessings, then we're not tempted to make up blessings. Have you ever been with somebody, and this isn't necessarily a wrong thing, but like things aren't going well for them, and they're like, well, it could be a lot worse. Well, and you say, well, that's true. It's not exactly a blessing, right? It's not actually exactly evidence that God's with you. Or, well, this is okay because one day there'll be heaven, right? Those are blessings, but they're not as tangible as when things are going well for you. We have to kind of backpedal a little. If you meet somebody and you say, how are things going? And they're like, well, I'm just kind of hanging in there until I can go to heaven. I'm just kind of there. Then things aren't going well, but they're looking for that blessing. But when things are going really well, it's really easy to see, God's with me, right? That's what he's saying here. A thankful heart is one that's really full of praise. It's really easy to praise God when you're really thankful for the things you have, and you have to have things to be thankful. Well, you don't, but the more things you have, the more opportunities for thankfulness you have, and that means the more opportunities for praise. And life is easy, and he's longing for those days again, when he just knew that God was with him because he had things. But now, things are different. In chapter 30, verse 19, he hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. For I know that thou wilt bring me to death, and to the house appointed for all living. Howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. I missed verse number 11, but let me read that. Because he hath loosed my cord and afflicted me, they have also let loose the bridle before me. He says, God, things before were great. I had a secret communion with God. He was blessing me. All this stuff was in my life, my children, my substance. Everything was great. But now, God's loosed my cord. He took away all my stability. Yeah, if your stability is in your things, and when those things are gone, then you're going to lose some of that. Verse 19, he threw me in the dirt. He cast me off in a dirty, miserable place. We as Christians can remember that Christ went beyond the dirt and the mire, even into the grave, and came out for us. But he doesn't have that perspective here. In verse 20, he says, I pray, but God doesn't hear. Now, isn't it true that we know theologically? Like if you ask anybody on the street that believes in God, hey, can God hear you? Everybody's going to say, yeah, absolutely, God can hear me. Right? But that's a theological understanding. If even if you were taking Anselm's God as a perfect being, yes, a perfectly good being must be able to hear all things. He must know all things even before I say them. It's true. The idea is not God doesn't hear me, but I'm talking to God and he's not answering me. That's the problem. And it's even worse because you know that he hears you. You ever had something where you ask somebody a question and they just don't do it, and just because they don't hear you very well? You guys know what that's like, right? See? You ask somebody something and they're just like, they're not going to do it because they can't hear you, but that's not true with God. So if God doesn't answer, it's really because, well, we don't know why. But it's not because he didn't hear you. We want answers. In verse 21, he feels like God's been cruel. And this word cruel, and this is probably one of the most ouch. Job is really feeling this. Thou art become cruel to me. That word cruel, it's only found 4 times in the Old Testament. One of the times is in Deuteronomy where he's talking about the poison of asps. That's what he feels like God's been poisonous to him. That God's been mean, cruel to him. He is against a power that he has no hope of winning against. But it's also that hand that upholds him. He understands that, but there's this conflict. In verse 22, he feels like the only thing he has underneath him is the wind. God's picked him up like in a tornado or a hurricane. He has nothing underneath him. In verses 23 and 24, he says, I'd really love to die. In fact, that's the first thing he says in Job chapter 3. Remember, he says, you know what would be great? Death. And he says, God, you can give it to me, and you refuse to do that. So what do you want from me? You're not letting me be happy. You're also not letting me die, which would make me happy. So you're just in this for what? We as Christians need to understand that our circumstances can't turn what we know to be true. I've had people who, we're coming to the church here or a part of the church, and they left and they said, Pastor, you've changed. And everybody else is like, no, they changed. Yeah, I can see someone drifting away and they're like, oh, your preaching changed. Like, it didn't. It's the same. And I'm not trying to blame anybody. I'm just like, don't blame me, right? And that's the way we feel like, oh, God's changed. He's turned mean all of a sudden. Well, we talked about this morning. God doesn't change. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if there's something going on, it's either that we've changed or that we don't understand what God is doing in these circumstances. But I've been there. There's a temptation to think, maybe what I thought about God was wrong. All this stuff about him being good and wise and loving, maybe I was wrong about all that. Well, you might have to come to a point where you ask yourself those very questions and have to answer, do you really believe that? What's changed? When I came to that question, I said, well, no, God hasn't changed, just my circumstances. And I'd be a fool to throw away my belief in a loving, good God because of my circumstances, because that's going to change too, and they have. Circumstances, if you live any length of time, you know that things change. Circumstances change, and so to throw all that away is a really foolish thing, but Job's being honest. This is how he feels. So he's talking about the perceived loss of blessing, and then he talks about the loss of the esteem of others. And this is kind of a bulk of what he talks about in these passages, because Job was an important member of his community, and that's lost too. Verse 7 of chapter 29, verse 7, when I went out to the gate through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, the young men saw me and hid themselves. Not because they were scared, but because he was a venerated person and they didn't want to say the wrong thing in front of him. And he was just so wise, they couldn't bear to be around him in a way, right? And the aged arose and stood up. You ever had that? You walk into a room and everyone just stands up out of honor? I haven't, but I can imagine what that'd be like. It's like when you watch some kind of royal coronation, or like when the president comes and everyone stands up and they're clapping and stuff. I've never had that where I walk into a room and everyone's clapping. He said, that's what it was like for me. I'd walk into the public square and everybody's like, Job's here, right? Verse 9, the princes refrained talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The nobles held their peace and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard me, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. Because I delivered the poor that cried and the fatherless and him that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me. And I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My judgment was as a robe and as a diadem. I was eyes to the blind and feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not I searched out. And I brake the jaws of the wicked and plucked the spoil out of his teeth. Men respected Job. They gave way for him when he came into view. And when his voice was heard in the marketplace, everyone says, oh, now we'll get the answers we're looking for, right? He was esteemed. People clamored for his opinion and valued his wisdom. And he was a help to the oppressed and the needy. There were a lot of people living in his area that were glad that Job was around because he used his wealth and his help and his resources to help people. And that was the right thing to do. Even if we don't crave men's approval, it's pretty easy to get it when things are going well. And there's something about that when everybody likes you, right? I've recently had some conflict with some people that was really unintended, and I'm also not sure what to do about it. And it bothers me, not because I want the praise and approval of men. I do. But in these cases, I can say, no, this is just really something that I want to make right because it's the right thing to do. So I know what it's like to have people appreciate you and then also have people kind of angry with you. And I guess I'd like the first one rather than the second one. People assume, though, in this case, that if you're wealthy, that you must have wisdom, because you have favor from God, especially in these times where wealth was really measured by this. People will pretend to love you because they think you might give them something. And those who are most needy will be glad for you, but maybe they're not your actual friends. But at least for Job, he's saying, it was nice to be able to walk into the public square and people were glad that I was there. They knew me, they recognized me, they were glad for me. But now, everything's different. In chapter 30, verse 1, but now, they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. These guys are making fun of me, and they're the kind of people that I wouldn't even hire their dads to look after my sheepdogs. Like, that's the kind of people these guys are. And they're making fun of me. Maybe a little bit of pride here. But he's thinking about this. This is how far things have come. Verse 2, yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age was perished? For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste. He's describing these people that are making fun of him, these people that are pumping themselves up over him. He's like, these guys, the guys that had to keep going into the wilderness whenever things got bad for them, who cut up, in verse 4, mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. They didn't have any kind of pasture or farming. They were, out there in the marshes digging around for roots that they could eat. Verse 5, they were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valleys and caves of the earth and in the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed like a donkey. Under the nettles they were gathered together. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. And now am I their song. Yea, I'm their byword. They abhor me. They flee far from me and spare not to spit in my face. I used to be honored. People used to love me. The nobles, the princes, everybody loved me. And now these punks whose dads are worse than gum on somebody's shoe, to put it in a present day vernacular, they're spitting in my face. These guys, they're singing songs about old Job. I'm a byword for them. I'm a picture of desolation. How far have things come? In verse 29, I'm a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. Those are just the kind of animals that live. The word dragon is like a jackal or a hyena. Basically, these kind of animals that live where there's a bunch of ruins and nobody else lives. He's like, that's where I am. I'm out in the middle of nowhere, it feels like. I've got these 3 friends. So happy for them. And my wife who says, curse God and die. Yep, things are great. It used to be, if I wanted to meet with any of the nobles or the princes or anybody, I could set up a meeting, and they were asking me for meetings, and now I'm all alone. And whenever I go out, these young punks, they want to make fun of me, how things have changed, and it's not even my fault. You get it with someone like Harvey Weinstein or something like that. He deserves it, right? Bernie Madoff, if somebody, slapped him in prison, we'd all be like, well, that's not nice, but I get it, right? But not Job. Job didn't do anything. Job was a perfect man. He was righteous. And here he's going through all of this. Even the young people, the poor homeless fools, deride and mock him. And rejection of others in our grief makes it really hard. We as a church, we as Christians want to help people that are going through grief, but we don't. A lot of people don't come around because they don't know what to say. They don't know how to help. If I went, I wouldn't know what to say. Well, I've encouraged you as a church to find out what to say and to educate yourself on how you can help somebody who's going through grief. Many people don't come around because it's depressing. It's hard to just put yourself in a depressing situation, right? We always kind of assume that somebody else is going to do it. It's hard. It's hard to do ministry with people that are really hurting, because it's hard to wade into that. And I've been there. And as a pastor, I do marriage counseling, and I tell you, that takes a toll on me. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, I get it. I get why people don't really want to, why no one wants to go talk to someone who's hurting and depressed, because it's a hard world to just jump into, unless you're getting paid for it. It's pretty hard to do just on your own, So that's why a lot of people don't do it. Many people reject this whole idea because they feel like God's punishing them. Like they say, I'm not going to go talk to that person because, and subtly, right, in a way, God must be doing something to them. And I don't want to get too close to what God's doing and punishing here. I don't want to stand up for them. They say you find out who your friends are when the tough times come. And here's Job, and he says, yep, I did. I found out what people really thought of me, and that hurts. I don't like that at all. All the more reason that we as Christians ought to come alongside people that are hurting. In Romans 12:15, rejoice with them that do rejoice and weep with them that weep. We like the first part, and the second part's a little harder to do. In 2 Corinthians 1:4, God who comforteth us in our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble, by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. God's comforted me. I have an obligation to go and help comfort others with that same comfort I received. Galatians 6, verse 1, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. I haven't had any pastor friends who have had to get out of the ministry for terrible reasons. I've thought about what I would do, and again, that's a different thing, isn't it? I have had friends who have had real hard times when people in their church, they have a church split, people say unkind, untrue things about them. I want to be the kind of pastor that would come alongside them and help them walk through that, because it's not an easy thing. So there's the loss of the esteem of others, and that's really hard. It's hard enough to bear the loss of all your stuff and your kids, and then you find out that you don't have any friends. And the people that were so in awe of you that they hid themselves now don't have any problem going and spitting in your face. And that's I wouldn't say worse, but it just kind of heaps on the picture of what's going on with Job. Then finally, we have the loss of comfort and the obtaining of pain. Job remembers the day he was comforted. He says, I remember how great my life was. Look at verse 18 of chapter 29. Then I said, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. My root was spread out by the waters, and the dew lay all night upon my branch. My glory was fresh in me, and my bow was renewed in my hand. Unto me men gave ear, and waited, and kept silence at my counsel. After my words they spake not again, and my speech dropped upon them. And they waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouth wide as for the latter rain. If I laughed on them, they believed it not. And the light of my countenance they cast not down. I chose out their way, and sat chief, and dwelt as a king in the army, as one that comforteth the mourners. Job says, I had a pretty good life. I had a little nest, a little comfort, a little something. I was very assured about the way that this was going to go. I was going to live the rest of my days, enjoy my kids, my grandkids, maybe my great-grandkids, and I was just going to live out the rest of my life with happiness. Verse 20, he had constant refreshing, he had constant strength. He was a blessing and a help to others. He was enriching his community, which in turn enriched him. We all want an easy life. In the U.S., I don't think that we really think very much about how easy we have life. Sometimes you do, I know that, but you just think about all the stuff you don't have to do because we have all these modern conveniences. You have all the information of the world almost at your fingertips. Like even us, when we get a bid from a contractor or something, I upload it to Google and I can get all that information right on my phone. I mean, I was sitting up here during the offertory because I realized we didn't have enough sheets, and I printed things. I got onto my computer in my office and printed them off so that Jacob could go and cut them. That's how much information we have at our fingertips, right? We have amazing access to food and almost any kind of food you could want. Like, I don't know where you could buy a lobster right now in Park Rapids, but probably somewhere, you know? We have such an amazing access to food. And shelter and help. The products in our country are made cheaply, and you can buy almost as many as you want, as you'll ever need. These are called, in some other places, because we have such nice things, then we get, as Americans, very picky, right? Oh, that fruit has a spot on it. I'm not going to buy that. This thing has a little thing wrong with it. I'm going to take it back to the store and see if I can get a refund to get something nice. And we say, well, of course you do that. Yeah, because that's the way we think. My phone's a little slow. I'm going to go get a new one. My TV remote is low battery. These are called first world problems. Oh, I got to get up, walk across the room and hit the button on the TV. You know, this is tough stuff. We don't like anything that's in my fridge, or I like the stuff in my fridge, but I have to cook it, and I don't want the food then. I want it now, right? These are, again, I'm not saying these are sinful to have these thoughts. I'm just saying, do you realize how nice we have it? Really, really nice. And when we have all these conveniences, and it shows how easy life is, then we can hopefully use that life to be a blessing to others. What I'm saying is that when you lose some of those things, we realize how much we rely on it, right? It's difficult to be a blessing to others when it's just easier to stay in comfort. I would go and X, but probably someone else would do it. I'll just let them do it. I would like to go do this, but I'm really comfortable here. Like, have you ever, there's something that you needed to do and you didn't do it just because it's a little chilly out? I'm not talking about February weather, like where it's dangerous to go outside or whatever, but have you ever just like, I just don't feel like doing it, and so I don't? Sure, all of us have had that. Do you know that most of the world don't get those kind of luxuries? They have to do the thing, whatever it is. And I found that in my own life that I try not to avoid. Now, obviously, there's a certain amount of pain that we avoid, but I try not to make it so that my life is completely free from pain, because then when I get pain, it hurts more. Have you noticed that? Like when you're trying to totally get yourself away from pain, then it hurts more. So like when I get a headache, I don't take an ibuprofen or something unless I really, really have to. Like I'll get a little pain in something, and I'm not just gonna try to get rid of that pain. I just like, well, this is part of living in a sin-cursed world. And I don't want to just get to the point where I can't have any kind of pain in my life. But we as Americans have really conditioned ourselves that any kind of pain, any kind of discomfort is no good. If you're discomforted at all, if there's anything in your life that is making your life even a little bit inconvenient, you got to deal with that. And we've kind of learned that in America. And this is where Job is. And I think this is why now that he's lost everything, he's just like, what about my nest? It was so nice. And that makes it worse when you lose everything. How much better to be content with the little that you have and to be used to being in pain, discomforted, or even to enter into somebody else's pain and discomfort so that when it comes, you're not so surprised. If you've ever been, there are people that are living in chronic pain, and I just can't imagine that. Like I have so little pain that when I hear about, so like my dad, he's had, I don't know how many back surgeries and hip surgeries. He broke his hip in a car accident. And he just lives with constant pain. He's like, it's just always there. And I can't imagine that. I understand. I'm not saying I endorse this at all. I'm just saying I understand why people say, hey, yeah, we should make euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide legal because I'm just always in pain. I'm not there, but I can imagine if I was there, that would be a really, really hard thing to live with. But Job was saying, that wasn't my life. I was living in luxury. But now, look at chapter 30, verse 25. Did not I weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? When I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of affliction prevented me. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried in the congregation. Again, I'm a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. My harp also is turned to mourning, and my organ into the voice of them that weep. Notice verses 15 through 18 of chapter 30. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passeth away as a cloud. And now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. My bones are pierced in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. By the great force of my disease is my garment changed. It bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. He says, I'm afraid, I'm full of terrors. All my comforts are gone. Verse 17, I'm in pain, and there's no rest from it at all. Verse 18, the disease stays with me like a garment that I can't take off. Verse 26, I wanted some relief, but nothing came. Verse 30, I'm suffering in my own skin. Verse 31, I mourn and I weep, and I'm miserable. This is where Job is, and he says, the worst thing is that it was so nice before, and now it's so hard. Just that contrast. And if you're living in pain and misery and it gets a little worse, you don't notice. But when you fall that far, it's really, really hard. And Job is saying, this is the hardest part. That not just that it got a little harder for me, but that it went so drastically the other direction. However, it's true that those who suffer are better able to worship God. That seems in some ways counterintuitive, especially what we said about the blessing. Job had the right heart at the beginning. At the beginning, he said, shall I not take the good and shall I not take the bad as well as the good? If God's willing to give me blessings. and he wants to give me pain. Shouldn't I take the pain? But now he's thinking on this, and he's not in that right headspace that he was before. I read an article from a National Institutes of Health, and so this is a government-sponsored study, but it was about the idea that people that have a relationship with God are able more readily to deal with pain and loss. It says this, quote, spirituality and religion may influence the experience of pain and fatigue. Religious people are less likely to have pain and fatigue, according to Bayes and Bowen. They obtained data from 37,000 individuals, 15 years of age or older, with fibromyalgia, back pain, migraine headaches, and chronic fatigue syndrome. And those who are spiritual but not affiliated with regular worship attendance are more likely to have those conditions. They also found that those with chronic pain and fatigue were more likely to use prayer and seek spiritual support as a coping method compared to other people. Pain sufferers who were both religious and spiritual were more likely to have better psychological well-being and use positive strategies. Therefore, it would seem appropriate for an individual's spirituality and or religion to be considered as part of the evaluation and management plan, as it may be a useful coping strategy. Now, again, this is just secular people talking about this, but the idea is that if you'll rely on the Lord, he'll get you through even those hard times. So our focus then should be not on our circumstances. And Job slips here. He's really thinking about the way things were and really imprinting that on God. He's got one more chapter, and he sort of takes God to task. He sort of demands that God gives him an answer. Notice the end of chapter 31, the words of Job are ended, and that's true. Then we'll hear from Elihu, but he's kind of ramping up. He's like, things were great, now they stink, and it's kind of God's fault, and I'd like an answer. So 31 is where we'll get an answer. But just understand, this is kind of the slope that he's on, and because the focus is on the physical, all the stuff he lost, the way that he lost it, his friends, his prestige, everything that came with it, he's thinking about these punks, these kids that are making fun of him, and all of that is kind of boiling up. And we as Christians need to just not only be aware of that, like I said this morning, Satan's going to try to get you any way he can, but also, too, just to be so involved in one another's lives that we can see when our friends are boiling over. I'm glad for my friends who are like, you seem a little off, Josh. You seem like you're getting a little out ahead of yourself. I'm like, thank you for the reminder, and you're praying for me, and I appreciate that. And we can do the same thing for each other as well when we get a little out of where we should be. That's where Job is, and you can hardly blame him, but we do anyway. The Scripture gave us this, not because it's the right way to think, but because that's the way he was thinking. God's not being cruel, right? We're not saying that God says, I am cruel. He's saying this is what Job thinks, and eventually Elihu's going to correct it, and God will come even farther and say, you have no idea. But where Job is right now, it's a dark place. It's a valley, and may God spare us from that. God, help us, Lord, in our loss. Help us, Lord, to, in greater measure, depend on you and rely on you and see you as not the taker away of everything, but the sustainer of everything. Lord, we want to see you in that way so that you might be honored. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen.